So what must be the most ridiculous, outrageous, hard to believe story in the Bible is Noah's Ark and the flood. But Henry C. Kinley endorsed this story like it really actually happened, like it's a factual, historic event. And so do Christians. They think it really happened too. But, they just believe. We're supposed to be looking at things, like, hey, we want some proof, right? Okay, so let's look at the details as to why this could or could not have happened. So there's a lot of animals that are indigenous to only specific regions of the world. Australia is a great example. Those marsupial type creatures, the kangaroo, the wombat, the koala bear, those sorts of animals. And they only eat specific food, like the koala bear only eats eucalyptus leaves. So you are going to have to not only get those creatures from those habitations, you're going to have to bring the food that they eat, and enough for about a year. We're going to have to really believe in a lot of magic to make this work, okay? So how did they cross the Indian Ocean to meet up in the Middle East to get on Noah's Ark, all the way from Australia? If they could have survived the trip, because they didn't do it by land because the land wasn't connected. But if it were, what do they eat along the way? Did the kangaroos hop over the Himalayan Alps to get to the Middle East? They would have froze to death. It's impossible. And I'm just cherry picking a couple examples. We still have the llamas and the different kinds of monkeys in South America. You've got the wolves of North America and the grizzly bears. All those sorts of different species that are only indigenous to those regions. And the types of food that they eat that are only from those regions. It was a matter of total impossibility that you would have to bring them over the oceans unless Yahweh levitated them and dropped them, from a spaceship or something. Plus, we really never did reconcile all the reptiles and the insects and all sorts of creepy little creatures and ticks and slugs and bloodsuckers and all kinds of stuff that would have been detrimental to be on the ark. But they needed to be somewhere because they couldn't have been floating around in that water that long. They would have all been dead. But aside from the logistics, the biggest problem I see is the food. Where did you store all this food? How did you have fresh meat? A lot of those animals only eat fresh kill. So how did you stop the carnivores from eating all the herbivores? How did you store enough, bulk and brush to feed an elephant 500 pounds of leaves every day? And, it's just all so many impossibilities there. There's no detail given about that. And then those creatures, who was going to feed them, at their different feeding times? You need an entire zoological staff. It couldn't have just been Noah's 3 sons and their wives. Okay, but even if you could have managed that, and they all didn't get sick, and all the food didn't rot, and everybody wasn't dead the first month, which really would have been what happened. But even if you could have survived, you're going to have a really big problem. Make that 2 big problems. One is you had to get all those animals back to their, original habitation, get them back over those tens of thousands of miles of ocean. And how did they survive that trip? You would have to have that food for them, which you just got done from an earth that had been totally inundated with water. So how did you feed them? You had nothing to feed them after that happened, right? So now you got to get them all back. And then you have the problem of genetics. 1 male and 1 female of every species, or 2 males and 2 females of every species, would have never been enough to reproduce the generations because you didn't have enough genetic variance. And now I'm going to turn this over to somebody who has a background in genetics that's going to explain this to you better than I can. Enjoy.
So the question is, how many of each species would Noah need to put on the ark in order to repopulate the world? In the game of life, the magic numbers are 50 and 500. In order to avoid the problems of inbreeding and reduce the number of genetic disorders from a buildup of harmful recessive genes, there needs to be at least 50 individuals in a population. Therefore, Noah needed to round up 50 of every species, not just 2 of every species. This probably would have taken a very long time, so hopefully he'd get some help from that big guy upstairs. Unfortunately, that's some bad news for Noah. The 50 individuals would make it possible for the animals to breed without the risk of harmful genes killing off the entire species. However, this number would not be enough to ensure a population would be able to adapt to environmental change. Basically, 50 individuals are needed to save them from themselves. but many more are needed to save them from the changes in the world around them. In order for a species to be able to survive long-term in the wild, a minimum number of 500 individuals is required. The optimal percentage of females to males would not be 50-50, but closer to 75-25, with the majority being females. This is because, in terms of reproduction, females tend to be much more important than males. A male can impregnate multiple females, but the females of the species must bring the offspring to term. They also have much more invested in the offspring and can only get pregnant when they're not already carrying a baby.
So as you can see, if you examine the scientific details about Noah's Ark and the flood story, you can see that it just doesn't work, and there's way more reasons that you never even thought about. Okay, so but my bigger issue is that Dr. Henry C. Kinley, who said that he received Yahweh Elohim himself in his heart and mind, that he knows it all, and he's endorsing this story. I mean, that right there ought to make you think twice.